Well, now we are going to move on to our next presentation. So, Sophia, I'm going to ask you to say hello. How are you today? Turn your camera on and say hello.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, you sound
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you so much. And so
Great.
while you're pulling up your slides, can you give us a self-introduction?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Great. Can everybody see my screen? I just want to make sure everybody's able to see what I'm
Yes, that looks
sharing.
perfect.
Perfect.
That's
Okay, great.
perfect. Thank you so much. So the
Of
floor is
course.
yours. Take it away.
Okay, excellent. Well, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here. I am joining this forum for the first time, so glad to see so many other women joining from different industries, disciplines, and so really excited to be here and to share a little bit about myself, but also to share a presentation after this. By way of introduction, I am currently a VP of Finance at a company called Chime. The company is about 1,300 people. It's a mission-driven financial technology company based out of San Francisco. I have been at Chime for about a year and a half now. And prior to Chime, my career is really spanned many different industries, but most recently, over the last decade, I have been in tech. I held leadership positions in finance at Amazon and Salesforce. And at Amazon, I joined the company to really help them launch Echo Alexa and led this hypergrowth Echo Alexa business. Had the opportunity to grow this business from just one device in one country to over 20 devices across 15 countries. And with Alexa ending up, by the time I left, speaking 10 languages. And then at Salesforce, I was head of finance for all of their large acquired companies, which included Tableau, Slack, and MuleSoft, and managed over 10 billion in revenues as a result of these companies, and really helped to integrate these acquired companies into Salesforce. And before I got into tech, I started my career in consulting at BCG and then transitioned to M&A and held finance roles at KPMG, Travelers, and Aramark. As far as my education, I have an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and have an MBA from Boston University. And I live in Kirkland, Washington, with my husband and my two children, David, who's 16, and my daughter, Angelina, who's 12. So I have a high schooler and a middle schooler. And then as far as what I do outside of work, I think my full-time job outside of work ends up being a lot around my kids and their activities. But as a family, we do a lot of outdoorsy activities. We ski, we travel, we try to get outside as much as possible. But those are kind of the activities that I engage in outside of work. So that's the introduction about me. And with that, I will actually move on to my slides. So the topic I am passionate about and the topic I wanted to talk about today with this group is about inclusivity and what it means to be an inclusive leader. And so I will go through a few slides here, but effectively the key to inclusive leadership is obviously creating an environment of belonging. And so let's go through kind of how we're going to cover this. So we'll start off, I'll talk a little bit about what inclusive leadership actually means. We'll then move on to talking about characteristics of inclusive leaders. And then we'll spend some more time on humility and empathy, which is part of inclusive leadership and why it's important. Okay, well, I think most of us have heard this term inclusion, but what does inclusion really mean? What I did here was I kind of combined a few different ways that we typically think about inclusion. And so inclusion can mean different things to different people, but for the most part, I think we talk about inclusion in a very similar way. We talk about inclusion as openness, we talk about as transparency, integrity, sharing information, building relationships that are authentic, and communicating in a value-driven way. And so this is sort of just lots of different ways that we typically talk about inclusion. But inclusion, in a nutshell, is all about focusing on the whole person, making sure we are not just thinking about ourselves in a situation. And so I did want to go through and spend some time on why inclusive leadership matters and why it's important. Inclusive leadership, you can see a few quotes here that I've gathered, effectively, we really, as leaders, it's important to be inclusive and to focus on this topic, because when everyone is included, everyone wins. We see better productivity, we see better results. The teams we're operating end up being stronger and more engaged. And with inclusive leadership, people really feel that they belong and that everybody is feeling like they're in versus feeling like they're out. And just, I think it's important to understand the requirements of inclusion by really digging into understand what behaviors we don't want to engage in and what exclusion really means as well. So what makes people feel included in organizations? And so here I've jotted down a few things. It's not really just one thing that makes people feel included. It does come down to multiple variables. It is about an organization's mission, its policies, practices, your coworker behaviors, but it also comes down to leaders and managers that each of one has. And what leaders say and do makes up to a 70% difference as to whether an individual reports feeling included. So it really does matter who we're working with, who we're working for, and how we operate as leaders ourselves. And the more people feel included, the more they speak up, they're willing to go the extra mile, they're willing to collaborate, all of which ultimately lifts organizational performance. And employees who feel excluded tend to be about 25% less productive based on research and have a 50% greater risk of turnover and are less willing in general to work hard for the team. They start to disengage. They start to look for other opportunities. And so when we see that, we typically see people start to withdraw, pull away. However, when people feel included, we see results that are sustainable. So that's why it's important. And then moving on to what characteristics do inclusive leaders share amongst themselves? There are really 6 characteristics that I jotted down here. The first is visible commitment. And visible commitment is, how do they show up day to day? Do they really walk the walk and not just talk the talk, right? A lot of times we hear leaders say the right things, but they don't always do the right things. And so a lot of times visible commitment is just consistency in how they're showing up. And it's consistency around diversity, how they challenge the status quo, how they hold others accountable, and how they make inclusion a personal priority. The second characteristics of an inclusive leader is humility. They're modest about their capabilities. They're willing to admit mistakes, that they're not always going to be right. And they create space for others to contribute. So it's really not just a one-person show. It is about the team. It's about people they're working with and making sure they can show up authentically. The third one is awareness of bias. They show awareness of personal blind spots. We know none of us are perfect. We're going to have blind spots. We do, all of us have personal biases as much as we try not to have them. It does depend how we grow up, our environment, our experiences all form these biases. And so just being aware of those personal blind spots, as well as flaws in the system, and working hard to ensure that there is a meritocracy, that there's fairness, but making sure people know that you're aware as well as a leader. And then a few others that I think are important that are characteristics of inclusive leaders. Others are curiosity about others. They want to have relationships. They demonstrate an open mindset. They're deeply curious about others. They listen without judgment. And they often come across as empathetic, understand people's situations outside of work. And so that's the curiosity piece. The next one here is cultural intelligence. They are attentive to others' cultures and adapt as required. And then the last one here is effective collaboration. They empower others, pay attention to diversity of thinking and psychological safety, and focus on team cohesion. And so those are kind of the 6. And then what comes to mind after these 6 is, well, which one is the most important characteristic? If we could just pick one that resonates the most as far as inclusivity goes. The one that research shows is the most important is leaders' visible awareness of bias. And research shows that of the 360-degree inclusive leadership assessments I think many of us have taken those or been part of them. More than 400 leaders made by almost 4,000 raters, they revealed that while all 6 traits are important and operate as a cluster, a leader's awareness of personal and organizational biases is the number one factor that people care about most. People care not only that the leaders are aware of their biases, but that this awareness is accompanied by 2 other behaviors, humility and empathy. So yes, it's important to be aware of your biases and to show up and make sure you're authentic, but there's also the humility and empathy element in how you come across that really resonates with people and makes them feel included. And so what I wanted to do next is talk about a few of these behaviors. What does humility look like in practice? And we've seen a few examples of these, I'm sure many of us in our day-to-day life. And so here I included what not to do and what to do. And so what not to do as an example of humility is an example of, hey, I know I have this prejudice, but whatever I am, I'm not willing to change, right? We've heard some of our leaders talk that way, and it doesn't come across and doesn't usually land well with people across the company. And what to do is just be humble, acknowledge your vulnerability to bias, ask for feedback on your blind spots and habits. And, coming across and saying statements like, I may not get this right the first time around, but I'm committed to trying and understanding your point of view. I would just ask that you give me feedback as we go through this process. This type of statement you can see is very different than the one above, where you're all of a sudden engaging someone, you're highlighting that you may not know everything, you may need some support, you're open and welcome to feedback. And I think that those are the statements that make leaders come across as having humility. And when awareness of bias is combined with high levels of humility, it can increase the rater's feelings of inclusion by up to 25%. So this one really matters for people, which is why I wanted to include the percentages here, because this behavior really is very important in how we show up. The next one is empathy. I also wanted to dig in a similar way on empathy. So empathy, what not to do. People aren't looking for the leaders to try to understand their viewpoint and experience as a dry intellectual exercise. They want to feel like somebody's actually cares about them. We spend the majority of our time at work. And when we don't see that empathy for who we are as people, a lot of times you just don't feel as connected to that person or to that job. And what to do is to show empathy in practice. That means understanding others deeply and leaving them feeling heard, just investing the time to make people feel heard. For example, one of my best managers, I wanted to share a personal story, was Sam. His empathy in interacting with others made Sam seem very approachable, trustworthy, and showed his eagerness to work with and support peers, colleagues, and superiors. And the way he would do that oftentimes during one-on-ones, just really spend the time, really give you the space and listen to the challenges you have and ask questions like, well, how can I support you? Where can I dive in with you? Is there anything you want me to dig into? And those are kind of these open questions. This ability to listen made this person as my manager as one that really I felt was extremely effective. And then when you look at the statistics, when awareness of bias is combined with high levels of empathy, it can increase a person's feelings of inclusion by up to 30%. So if you can get these two things right, empathy and humility, right away, you can see how people you work with can feel a lot more included, receptive, and just being aware of your biases. And having that awareness also will help you have a much more effective team. As far as a few others, why are humility and empathy so important? It just encourages people to be open, share their feedback. It gives people hope that a leader actually cares about them and takes their views into account and creates a sense of personal connection. And then when a leader prioritizes empathy and models non-judgmental behavior, it helps everyone feel a lot more, again, open. They're able to share their experiences and their state of mind. They're able to bring their whole selves to work. We talk about that a lot. Bringing our whole selves to work is not always easy, and it depends on the people you're working with. If you can feel comfortable to be yourself and bring yourself to work, Because you have an empathetic leader and an empathetic environment, it makes your day-to-day so much more engaging, so much more interesting. And then it can also alleviate stress and just reduce tensions and help people build stronger relationships with each other and feel much more connected to the organization. All of a sudden, they are invested in the mission of the organization, they're invested in the results of the organization. And it's because they're not dealing with all of these negative emotions that cause anxiety. And so this is another way to help people that you work with. How can you put these traits to work? I thought that was I wanted to share some tactics. Number one, I found these are my personal experience. I found these tactics really helpful. So the first one is just a personal advisory board. And it sounds formal, but what this is just a group of people that are often peers who have regular contact with you, with a leader, and to whom that leader can trust and talk and hear really honest feedback. These trusted advisors can give leaders feedback on everyday interpersonal behaviors that support or inhibit inclusion. For example, you may not know that you're doing this, and there's maybe a very different intention, but sometimes what can happen unintentionally is that a leader may not give equal time to all meeting participants, or that individual may favor those who are co-located over those who have dialed in. Other examples could be, does the leader always refer to one gender when giving examples, or does that individual refer to both? And if you can trust people, and that's your personal advisory board, it could be, like, for example, I work a lot with our leadership team at Chime and have done that in other companies. And so oftentimes, like, I'll just find a few people that I can trust in that room. And whether it's a presentation, whether it's something we're working through that's challenging, but I will ask for feedback and just say, look, if you notice these behaviors, just let me know, because I am looking for feedback. That's something I really would love to hear from you. And these become kind of my personal advisory board. And I have found that to be extremely effective and keeps this type of example top of mind every day. And the next one that I thought was really helpful is one, again, a personal experience, but I have found this has worked really well for me, is sharing your learning journey about recognizing and addressing biases. This is something that is hard to do, right? Again, discussing feedback from your direct reports openly with your direct reports. Actually, if somebody says, hey, Sofia, you could be doing this better, I try to find time and really dig in to understand what that really means. Is there a root cause? Is there something, maybe there was a misstep somewhere? But I think, again, being very open to having those transparent conversations, I think, is half the battle. And if you can open up, it creates space for people you work with to share that input with you. I think you can always improve and grow as an individual. Other things like creating inclusion moments, I find that to be important. So maybe identifying a person to speak at a town hall or a weekly team meeting, giving people opportunities to be visible, to shine. And I think that can come across, like, finding these inclusion moments where you can put people forward and really have them kind of be at the forefront has been something that I've really worked on. And then these types of actions just express humility, help leaders to test and build on their insights, and role model the importance of humility in addressing biases. And the last one is just challenge yourself. I look at this as kind of my tactic 3, as exposing yourself to new situations. Get uncomfortable. So immersing yourself in uncomfortable or new situations, which expose us to diverse stakeholders, different types of people we normally wouldn't work with. That certainly gets you to be inclusive and to kind of think outside the box. And this type of exposure combined with open-ended questions helps to expand horizons and disrupt preconceived ideas. So those are the 3 tactics that I thought were really helpful. And then I wanted to bring forward an example of inclusion that I've seen first. St. Marshall, she's on the board of Chime, and I had a chance to observe some of her behavior, but have started to dig in a little bit into her background. And St., she became a CEO of NBA Dallas Mavericks. she made a commitment to meet every member of the organization the first 90 days. The first question she would ask is, tell me your life story. And the message she wanted to send was the whole person matters, not just what they do at the company, but the entire person. And bringing your history, your values, and your personality to work with you is so important. And just as a leader, not putting a corporate mask on, not pretending to be a superhero, I think is something that she's really over-indexed on. And I've seen her play that part even in other interactions that she has. And these interviews for Sind, as she started this role, helped convey the messages that everyone matters, everyone belongs, and everyone has unique contributions to make to the team. And I think it made the team really feel included. And for Sind, she also got something out of it. She fell in love with the people she gets to work with. And for her, that was the most important duty of a leader. And there are only a few things that she said she needs to do as a leader. She needs to listen to the people, need to learn from them because they are the experts. And she gets to benefit because these individuals that she's now formed connections with and relationships with, they're in touch with what's happening out there in their day-to-day, and they're able to keep her more informed, keep her engaged about issues that are coming up. And so this investment of time to be inclusive initially has paid dividends for her throughout, both at Dallas Mavericks, but also throughout her career. And then just the conclusion here. So inclusive leadership, it's critical. It's something I know it's hard to keep constantly top of mind, but just with the right effort, most of us perceive ourselves as more inclusive than we are. Some of us lack confidence in our inclusive leadership capability, and so do less than we can to actively guide others and challenge the status quo. Without humility and empathy, it is difficult for leaders to gain deep insights into the nature of their blind spots and therefore to grow. And leaders who are humble and empathetic will be open to criticism about their personal biases and will have greater self-insight into personal limitations. And not only are these behaviors critical for leaders' personal development, they also serve to make others feel more included along the way. And so that's all I have for today. I hope you found this helpful. Again, I find this topic top of mind every day in my career. And so just wanted to share that with you.
Well, Sofia, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. And just a reminder, if anybody would like to ask a live question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. But let's go with some of the questions that have come in through the chat. This one that just came in from Antoinette. Antoinette says, I've had some great jobs when my leader was in touch, cared, and wanted to invest in the whole me, but have equally had some where this doesn't exist. My current boss is a man who is 180 degrees from this. How do you communicate upward that you feel like you're not being heard?
You know, my experience is being very direct and very honest is just really important, because if you don't tell someone how you're feeling, they won't know how you're feeling, right? And so just keeping it and thinking that it may not be something they care about can be our own preconceived notion versus that person may actually want to hear from you. And so the way I would approach it, and the way I've approached it in my career, I've had those experiences too, is just said, look, this is where I thrive. When I get this type of engagement, this type of involvement, I can do amazing work. And just share how you're feeling today, that you feel you have a lot more to contribute, but you're feeling the behaviors are not always exactly helping you succeed in your current role, and share how you feel that individual can support you as a manager. And so I think having that really open conversation, rather than making that person feel bad about what they're doing, just saying, hey, this is usually how I have seen, what works for me can mean something different, and just connect it to that, be very positive in your communication, but do say something. Say it constructively without making that person feel terrible about their day-to-day interactions with you. They may just not be aware, or they're too busy, or they're too focused on a problem at hand. And so just be open to having that disruptive conversation.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. And Cindy, I hope that answered your question. Cindy asked almost the exact same question, just in a slightly different wording. And I know we've had a couple of things that came in through the chat, but I'm going to ask you this question too. This question from Becca says, do you think that empathy can be taught, and can it grow with age? She follows up to say that my kids don't have any empathy.
Um, I also have kids, and I know sometimes it doesn't feel like kids have empathy, but again, I think it's reiterating why it's important to you and reinforcing those behaviors. Do I think empathy can be learned? I do. I think it's that just really highlighting areas where you're finding someone not being empathetic. I also think there are going to be examples where a leader just learns along the way, right? They're going to be like, there's some teams you see along the way where the teams have high attrition, or people just don't like working for that manager. As soon as they find out a manager is stepping into a role, they're like, oh, I need to go find a different role. It's not going to work for me. And a lot of times it's because they don't feel like that person's empathetic. They have humility. They can't connect with that individual. But I do think these experiences where a lot of times, if a leader can acknowledge that there's opportunity to learn, they will learn, but it has to be a two-way street. I think it is possible to obviously develop empathy, but the person has to want to develop empathy. It doesn't just happen. Like, you can't, if you're not open to it or receptive to it, it's not going to work. And we're going to have those instances. But for the most part, again, I think being open, having those constructive conversations will be helpful. But we can't obviously change everyone, and it's not going to be possible everywhere, but to the extent possible, I think if the person wants to and is receptive, it will work.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to go to ask you for final thoughts before we move on to our panel. And Kayla says, have you heard? Let's see. I'll go up two more questions. Actually, let's go with this one from Janine. And Janine says, how do you keep healthy boundaries with your team members when it comes to oversharing in personal lives?
I think that's a great question. Look, I think my personal experience has been, I try to show up consistently. Like, I look at myself as, look, I'm a person. I have a life outside of work. I have challenges outside of work. And the way that I approach it is, I talk about, like, there's some days where, look, I can have a challenging morning with kid drop off, or something is going on that I'm worried about. I do share, like, we talk about, how things are going, but it's obviously getting to know each other and having those very open kind of personal sharing moments, right? Those moments where I can be myself with them. I tell them what's happening in my life, and then they can also share what's going on with them on their side. And a lot of times what that does, I don't look at it as oversharing. I think oversharing it can be these unhealthy kind of relationships or friendships where you feel like the boundary of manager to your direct report or people that are on your team can get crossed. I definitely agree there is a boundary there. But overall, like, if you're showing up as like, hey, here's what's happening day to day with me, I think people are a lot more open to then share what's going on with them. And then it allows you to understand sometimes when work is taking a little longer, or somebody has to move out a deadline, that it has something to do with other areas of their life. And I think you're a lot more tolerant, you're a lot more accepting. And as a manager, you can offer help in a way that is actually allowing them to be successful. You can pull back, you can bring in another person to help them. So I actually don't know if I've seen too many examples of oversharing. I think if done right, like, if you're truly inclusive and authentic, the boundary is very healthy. But certainly, like, there are edge cases there. And I would just say, like, if it feels right, then just do it. Just be yourself. And if yourself is to share a little bit more, then just share a little bit more. I think it actually opens up more of that type of connectivity and relationship with those around you that you normally wouldn't have. When people feel like they know you, I think it's easier for people to work with you. And so I actually don't think it's too dangerous on the oversharing side.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, as we conclude, do you have any final words of wisdom for all of our viewers today?
Maybe just the final word of wisdom is, look, we all get so busy day to day. There's always, something urgent, something happening around us, both in our personal lives and at work. And inclusivity is something that is hard to keep top of mind, which is why, as a leader, if you can show up just consistently, if you consistently train yourself to show up a certain way, I think that consistency will earn you a certain kind of respect with your directs. And I think you're going to be able to do that more naturally. It will not be a forced behavior. It's like any habit, right? If you just train yourself to do that every day and it's top of mind every day, then it's not something you have to really spend a ton of time thinking about or working on. It becomes just a natural state. So I would just encourage all of you to think about how you show up with people around you, with your directs, with your leaders, where you can be more inclusive, where you can give somebody a voice, be open with people around you. And I think that will land and resonate. So those are my final thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sophia.
Of course. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.